Your garlic rotted again, sitting on the counter, soft and green, sprouted barely 2 months after you brought it home. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you assumed that was normal. You just assumed that garlic always does that. That food is supposed to expire on someone else's schedule. But what if I told you about a single bulb of garlic? Grown correctly, it can last an entire year on a shelf without refrigeration. It can be replanted from its own cloves indefinitely, and it can swell to 3 times the size of anything you have seen, anything you have ever seen wrapped in plastic at the supermarket. And what if the reason you have never experienced that has nothing to do with your skill, your soil, or your climate? It has everything to do with a carefully engineered system. A system designed to make absolutely sure you never could. Picture the garlic aisle for a moment. Those bleached, tight little bulbs sitting under fluorescent light, they look clean and they look reliable. But what you are actually staring at is an end product, a century-long project to ruin one of humanity's most resilient crops, turning it into something that just falls apart in your hands. The agricultural industry did not optimize garlic for you. Now, here is where it gets personal. You took that grocery store garlic home with you, or maybe you bought a packet of cloves from a garden center. Complete with a cheerful label and a planting guide on the back. You pushed them into the dirt 2 inches deep, just like the book said. You watered, you waited, and what came up was small. The seeds they sold you were wrong for your climate. The planting depth they recommended was calibrated for industrial speed. It was never calibrated for actual biological potential. And the single most critical step in the entire process was missing. The step that unlocks the genetic switch inside every clove. The one that transforms a modest planting into an explosion of growth. It was left out of every manual and every seed packet, left out of every extension office pamphlet you have ever read. Not because it is complicated, and not because it requires expensive equipment. There is an ancient mechanism buried in the DNA of every garlic clove. It is called vernalization, and it is an Ice Age survival clock. The plant needs to feel a specific window of deep cold, hundreds of hours below 40 degrees, before its genetics will even permit it to divide into multiple cloves. Without that signal, it just sits there like one sad lump. There is no division, and there is no real bulb. The master growers of previous generations understood this intimately. If their winters were not harsh enough, they just faked it. But the industry will never teach you how to trigger this mechanism, storing thousands of tons of seed garlic in climate-controlled conditions. Doing that before shipping just eats into their profit margins. It is cheaper to skip the step and accept the smaller bulbs. And let you believe that mediocrity is just how garlic works. The entire model starts with neutered genetics in the seed stock, down to the shallow planting advice on the back of the packet. This is not incompetence, it is careful architecture. Here is the part that should really make you furious. Every bag of synthetic fertilizer sitting on the shelf is a contract. Not a contract between you and a healthy harvest, but between you and a cycle of failure you cannot escape. That bright blue granular stuff does exactly one thing well. The one with the triple-digit nitrogen number screaming from the label. It makes beautiful, deep green magazine cover leaves, and underneath those leaves is a garlic bulb the size of a marble. But the deception runs deeper than what you pour on the soil. It starts with what you were told to do before planting. 2 inches deep, before the clove ever touches the dirt. That is the sacred number printed on every seed packet, echoed by every extension office, and repeated in every beginner blog. And it is a total fabrication engineered for the convenience of a machine. It was never engineered for the biology of the plant. Commercial garlic planters jam when they push cloves any deeper. Think about what that shallow placement actually does to the clove. 2 inches below the surface is the most volatile layer, the layer that bakes dry in an afternoon of sun. It heaves and cracks through every freeze and thaw cycle. And it holds almost no mineral reserves worth mentioning. You plant there, and you create a patient on life support. Now the clove needs your irrigation hose, and it needs your fertilizer. Farmers who grew bulbs the size of a fist centuries ago, they did not play by these modern industrial rules. They buried their cloves 4 or 6 inches down into the earth, and they did it on purpose. At that depth, the clove has to fight upward through heavy soil, just to break the surface, and that fight builds root architecture. The kind of roots that shallow planting can never produce. The roots push past the frost line and past the dry zone, down into layers where moisture sits undisturbed, where minerals have been accumulating over decades. The bulb swells against all that compacted earth pressing in, and as it pushes against every side, the skins tighten. The industry buried this knowledge because deep garlic breaks harvesters. It cannot be ripped out of the ground, it must be dug by hand. It requires labor, time, and care, three things that completely destroy profit margins at scale. So they engineered the shallow method and taught it to you. They taught it to you as the only valid method and built an entire supply chain around a weak bulb. A loose-skinned, quick-rotting bulb that it produces, and the nutrient strategy they replaced is almost insulting in its simplicity. The old growers did not broadcast chemical powder across an entire field, hoping some of it magically landed near a root. They placed crushed, charred bone directly beneath each clove, a concentrated pocket of phosphorus exactly where the roots would find it. Phosphorus does not wash away in the rain like nitrogen does. It locks into the soil and stays put, signaling the plant to invest everything in root mass and bulb storage instead of wasting all its energy on useless foliage. Picture a garlic bulb rotting in February, split open by frost. With its roots stunted to barely 2 inches long, now picture a bulb planted in the exact same soil. The same week, the same variety, but this one pushes roots a foot deep before the ground freezes. By spring, its underground network stretches further than the plant is tall. Same clove, same dirt, and the difference is not genetic. The difference is a biological law that was standard practice 200 years ago, before it was erased from public knowledge. Here is what the old growers understood that we forgot. The soil beneath your feet is not a dead sponge, waiting to be filled with chemical water. It is a living infrastructure operating on precise rules. Rules as precise as any circuit board. When you pile 6 to 8 inches of straw on a bed, rotting leaves or old hay on top of freshly planted garlic, you are not just keeping the ground warm. You are engineering a microclimate from the surface down. Under that blanket, in the dead of January, the temperature stays above freezing just long enough for roots to keep inching forward while exposed beds lock solid. Come spring, when bare soil bakes and dries in the afternoon sun, the mulched bed stays cool, damp, and biologically active. But what happens at the boundary between decomposing mulch and living soil? That is exactly where the real mechanism hides. As that bottom layer of organic matter breaks apart, it exhales carbon dioxide directly onto the soil surface. The young garlic leaves pushing up through the mulch. They are not breathing the same air you and I breathe. They are surrounded by a concentrated pocket of that enriched atmosphere accelerates photosynthesis like a bellows accelerates a forge. The plant manufactures sugar faster and stores more energy. It channels it straight down into the bulb. No plastic greenhouse and no gas injection system. Just a pile of dead leaves doing exactly what the forest floor does, what it has done for 100 million years. And the forest floor is the second half of this forgotten code. Old farmers would carry buckets of soil from beneath oak and hickory trees, and they would work it into their garlic beds by hand. They called it giving the bed spirit. They had no idea what they were actually transferring. What lived in that forest soil was a network of mycorrhizal fungi, organisms so fine that a single thread is thinner than a human hair. Yet collectively they can stretch for miles underground. When those fungi encounter a garlic root, they latch on, extending thousands of microscopic filaments called hyphae outward into soil pores that the root itself is far too thick to enter. They dissolve rock to reach locked-up minerals. They hunt for water in spaces the plant could never access alone. In practical terms, those fungi multiply the effective root surface area. They multiply it by roughly 1,000 times. Your garlic is no longer drinking through a straw, it is drinking through a river delta. Modern agriculture killed this network on purpose. Fungicides wiped the mycorrhizae out completely, because someone in a lab coat looked at fungal threads under a microscope and decided to call them pathogens. Once the fungi were dead, the roots could only absorb what they physically touched. The plant became utterly dependent on soluble fertilizer, delivered straight to the root zone, which meant you had to keep buying their product. Now layer these two laws on top of each other. Deep mulch creates the climate, and mycorrhizal fungi create the reach. Together, they rebuild the biological buffer, the buffer that every industrial field has been stripped of. And they do it for the cost of a trash bag full of autumn leaves and a single shovel of forest dirt. There is one more piece the old growers practiced that completes the picture, and it costs absolutely nothing at all. When a hardneck garlic plant sends up its flower stalk, That curling green scape is making a biological bet on sexual reproduction. The plant will pour 30 to 40% of its total energy reserves, pouring it into that single flower, siphoning it directly out of the bulb. The moment that scape curls into a full loop, you snap it off by hand with one clean break. What happens next is pure hormonal engineering. The plant registers reproductive failure and it panics. It abandons the flower plan entirely and dumps every remaining calorie into swelling the bulb, cloning itself underground as a backup strategy. These are not mystical rituals. They are operating instructions written into the biology of the plant itself. As legible as a wiring diagram once you know where to look. The old-timers who carried forest soil in buckets and buried their beds under straw were not guessing. They were reading a manual that the industry later shredded, because a self-sufficient grower is a lost customer. So if these rules have been sitting in plain sight for centuries, what exactly would happen if you stopped following the modern playbook and started following the forest instead? Here is what a garlic bulb looks like when left alone on purpose. The outer skin is tight, papery, and almost translucent. The cloves inside are fat enough to fill your palm. The roots, when you pull it from the earth, come out trailing a web of white threads so fine they look like smoke. That web is the point, and that web is the entire argument. A woman outside Asheville stopped buying fertilizer 3 years ago. She didn't replace it with compost tea or fish emulsion. She replaced it with absolutely nothing. What she did instead was so lazy, it almost sounds like a joke. She took a handful of leaf litter from the edge of the woods, crumbled it around the base of her garlic, and walked away. The following summer, her bulbs were wider than a tennis ball. Her neighbor had been feeding his garlic a strict diet of synthetic phosphorus, and he pulled bulbs the size of walnuts. He thought she was lying, but she was not. She had just accidentally rehired the oldest workforce on the planet. Beneath every forest floor, there is a fungal network running transactions that make Wall Street look primitive. Mycorrhizal threads dissolve rock and chase water through tight pores. Pores too tight for any root to enter, and they deliver the goods directly to the plant. The price of admission is a drop of sugar, and that is the deal. The plant photosynthesizes, skims a little sweetness off the top, and hands it to the fungi, and the fungi go shopping. It is an economy that has been running without interruption for 400 million years, and it costs you exactly $0 to tap into it. The moment you pour a bag of chemical fertilizer onto that soil, you completely blow up the deal. The plant gets cheap, easy food and stops paying the fungi. The fungal threads starve and the network collapses. And now your garlic is a pensioner with no savings, completely dependent on you showing up every week with another bag. That dependency is not a side effect, that is the product. You were never buying plant food, you were buying a subscription, so here is the counter move and it will feel wrong. Stop feeding the plant, and instead, feed the soil. Toss down a layer of plain, uncoated cardboard around your garlic. The kind your deliveries come in, and pile leaves on top. Add kitchen scraps if you have them, and walk away. That cardboard smothers weeds without you pulling a single one. The moisture trapped underneath becomes a paradise for fungi and earthworms. You did 10 minutes of work, and now a biological crew is running a 24-hour shift beneath your feet, building the exact fertility your garlic is hungry for. Then do one more thing that feels like breaking the rules. Do not plant your garlic alone. Tuck chamomile between the rows and scatter a few lettuce seeds. Let savory creep along the edges. This is not decoration. Chamomile releases compounds into the soil. Compounds that intensify the essential oils inside the garlic clove. The mixed scents rising from that bed create a fog that onion maggots cannot navigate. They are searching for a clean garlic signal, and all they get is noise. You just eliminated your pest problem without a single spray. By planting a few flowers and herbs you were probably going to grow anyway. Give the plants room and let wind slide between them. Fungal diseases need still, humid air and identical hosts. Packed shoulder to shoulder, the exact conditions of every commercial field. Your messy, spaced out, companion-planted bed is the opposite of that. It is a meadow, not a factory floor, and a meadow does not need a manager. The strangest part is what happens at the end of the season, when you finally pull those bulbs from the ground. Because what most people do next is rush to clean, cut, and dry. It is the one mistake that can undo everything the soil just built for you. Picture the next crisis where fuel prices spike, and trucking routes begin hemorrhaging money, and shelves go sparse. And there you are, standing in line, clutching the same pale, rubbery head of garlic. Harvested green on another continent 3 months ago, garlic that will sprout and rot before Friday. That is the future they designed for you. Now rewind and imagine a different version of that same week. Instead of racing to the store, you walk out your back door. You kneel beside a bed you planted 8 months ago. A bed where cloves went into the earth, 6 inches deep, tucked under a thick blanket of leaves and straw, partnered with crimson clover and threaded through with fungal networks. You pull a bulb from the curing rack in your shed, dense as a fist, with papery skin sealed tight. Sealed from 6 unhurried weeks of drying, with flavor so sharp it almost burns your fingertips. That bulb will still be perfect at Christmas. It does not need refrigeration, plastic, or a barcode. It only needed time and trust. This is where the conversation stops being about gardening. None of this was a gardening hack. It was a sovereignty protocol. Each step peeled your dependency off a system that profits from your ignorance. The agricultural supply chain did not accidentally forget these methods. It buried them because a grower who cures garlic for 6 weeks and replants from the same stock year after year is a customer who completely disappeared. You became invisible to the cash register, and that terrifies the model. Food independence doesn't start with acreage or expensive seed catalogs. It starts with a single bulb that you refuse to let the grocery store define. You cracked it into cloves with your own hands. You gave those cloves a winter in cold soil and let fungi do the feeding. You watched the scapes rise and you cut them because you understood the biology. The plant was asking you to redirect its energy downward into storage and into survival. And then, after harvest, you did the one thing the commercial world cannot afford. You just sat back and waited. The knowledge was never lost. It was just made unfashionable by people who had something to sell you. Now you have it back, a single clove, planted deep, mulched heavy, and cured slow. That is not a vegetable. That is a declaration that your dinner does not depend on someone else's logistics.